Imagine a family so consumed by power that brothers turned against brothers, sons rose up against their fathers, and blood soaked the throne of England for generations. This wasn't just any royal house, this was the Plantagenets, a dynasty built on ambition, betrayal, and an insatiable hunger for control. From the moment Henry Plantagenet seized the crown in the 12th century, his family's name became synonymous with intrigue, violence, and the ruthless pursuit of power. Their story is one of legendary clashes where love was often overshadowed by treachery and loyalty was a luxury few could afford. Picture medieval England, a land of towering castles, shadowed corridors, and whispered plots. Here, the Plantagenets didn't just rule, they wove a tapestry of chaos and conquest. Henry II's reign began with promise, yet it unraveled into a nightmare as his own sons, Richard the Lionheart, John Lackland, and their brothers turned on him, each hungry for their share of the kingdom. The family's feuds weren't confined to the battlefield. They played out in bedchambers and council rooms where a single misstep could mean exile or execution. And this was only the beginning. Over the centuries, the Plantagenets' thirst for dominance would ignite civil wars, topple kings, and pave the way for one of history's most infamous conflicts, the Wars of the Roses, where the dynasty ultimately tore itself apart in a storm of scarlet and white. But what drove this family to such extremes? Why did their legacy become a saga of endless strife? Behind every betrayal, every broken oath, lies a deeper story of human ambition, of what happens when power becomes an obsession. This is more than just a tale of medieval politics. It's a window into the darkest corners of the human heart, where love and loyalty battle against greed and pride. Over the course of this journey, we'll uncover the shocking twists, the forgotten players, and the moments that decided the fate of England. So settle in, because the Plantagenet story is about to unfold, and it's one you won't soon forget. Henry II didn't just inherit a kingdom, he built an empire with the cunning of a chess master and the ruthlessness of a warlord. By the time he was crowned King of England in 1154, he already held Normandy through his mother's bloodline. But Henry wasn't content with just one crown. His ambitions stretched across the Channel, where the fractured duchies of France promised land, wealth, and power for the taking. And then came Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose influence would shape the fate of Europe. Twice a queen, first to France and then to Henry, Eleanor brought the richest prize of all, Aquitaine, a sprawling duchy that made her the most powerful woman in Christendom. Their marriage wasn't just a union of hearts, it was a political earthquake, binding southern France to the Angevin realm and forging an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. But holding such vast territories wasn't as simple as drawing lines on a map. Henry spent decades fighting to keep his vassals in line, crushing rebellions in Brittany, outmaneuvering rival French lords, and tightening his grip on the English barons. His legal reforms, like the Assize of Clarendon, rewrote the rules of justice, strengthening royal authority while placating the nobility with a veneer of fairness. Yet for all his brilliance, Henry's greatest weakness would prove to be his own family. Eleanor, once his most formidable ally, grew disillusioned as Henry's affairs and iron-fisted rule chipped away at their partnership. And then there were his sons, raised on stories of their father's conquests but denied real power until it was too late. The stage was set for a bitter struggle where loyalty meant less than land, and even a king's love couldn't shield him from the knives of those closest to him. The Angevin Empire wasn't built to last. Its very foundation, patchwork territories held together by feudal oaths and royal will, made it fragile. Henry's sons would inherit not just his crown but his insatiable ambition, and the cracks he papered over with legal codes and battlefield victories would widen into chasms. Yet for all its eventual collapse, Henry's legacy was undeniable. He transformed England from a war-torn backwater into the heart of a European superpower, proving that even in an age of swords, the sharpest weapon was often the mind. Henry II's reign was a masterclass in control until he met a man who refused to bend. Thomas Becket wasn't just any priest, he was Henry's childhood friend, his drinking companion, the man he trusted enough to make Archbishop of Canterbury. The king expected loyalty, a partner who would help him reign in the church's power. But Becket shocked everyone. The moment the archbishop's robes touched his shoulders, he transformed, trading the indulgent life of a royal favorite for austere piety and fierce defense of the church's independence. What followed wasn't just a feud, it was a collision of two titans, each convinced God was on their side. The breaking point came over the constitutions of Clarendon, Henry's bold attempt to assert royal authority over the church. Becket refused to sign, declaring that clergy should answer only to divine law, not the king's courts. Henry's fury was legendary. He stripped Becket of lands, titles, even forced him into exile for 6 bitter years. When the archbishop finally returned, it wasn't in submission but defiance, publicly excommunicating Henry's allies. Then came those fatal words spoken in a rage by the king, likely never meant as an order. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took it as their cue. On December 29, 1170, they cornered Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral as he prayed at the altar. Witnesses say he didn't resist, merely bowed his head as their swords struck, splitting his skull with such force the blade shattered on the stone floor. The aftermath was a disaster for Henry. Becket's blood-stained robes became sacred relics overnight. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and within 2 years the murdered archbishop was declared a saint. The king's reputation never recovered. Forced to walk barefoot through Canterbury in penance, letting monks scourge his back, Henry became a cautionary tale, a ruler who learned too late that some lines couldn't be crossed. The political fallout reshaped England. The church's power grew stronger, its courts more independent, while Henry's dream of absolute control crumbled. Even his own family would use the scandal against him, whispering that a king who couldn't keep his own archbishop in line hardly deserved his crown. But the echoes of this clash went deeper than politics. Becket's martyrdom exposed the paradox at the heart of medieval rule, that even the mightiest sovereigns could be undone by the stubborn faith of one man. Centuries later, pilgrims still flocked to Canterbury, their footsteps tracing the path of a conflict that proved no throne was truly untouchable, not when the church held heaven's keys. Henry had gambled on fear to keep his empire intact, but in the end, it was Becket's quiet defiance that endured. A ghost haunting every Plantagenet who dared claim power was theirs alone to wield. Henry's greatest nightmare wasn't rebellion from his enemies, it came from his own blood. His sons, raised on stories of conquest and entitlement, grew restless under their father's iron grip. Young Henry, crowned as junior king but denied real power, became the spark. Encouraged by his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had grown disillusioned with Henry's rule, the prince began gathering allies among the disgruntled nobility of England and France. The flame of rebellion spread quickly. Richard, Geoffrey, and even young John, barely more than a boy, joined their elder brother's cause. What followed wasn't just a family quarrel, but a full-scale war that would ravage their empire for years. Eleanor's role was anything but passive. The queen who once rode beside Henry on campaign now masterminded the revolt from behind the scenes, using her vast network of Aquitanian vassals to funnel money and troops to her sons. Some whispered she sought revenge for Henry's infidelities. Others claimed she acted to protect her birthright from being swallowed by his Angevin machinery. Whatever her motives, the result was chaos. In 1173, the brothers struck, launching coordinated attacks across Normandy, Brittany, and Aquitaine. Castles changed hands overnight as barons, sensing weakness, abandoned Henry in droves. The aging king, who had once boasted his family would reign from the devil to the deep sea, now found himself fighting for survival against the very dynasty he built. The war's brutality shocked even medieval Europe. At the Battle of Dol in Brittany, Henry's forces nearly captured Richard, only for the young lion to escape by disguising himself as a common soldier. Young Henry, ever the showman, staged a mock coronation in Limoges, parading through the streets with a borrowed crown while his father's armies besieged the city. But the conflict's most shocking moment came when news reached Henry that his favorite son, John, had joined the rebellion, the betrayal cut deepest of all. Chroniclers wrote that the king collapsed, weeping, "I have lost everything now, even the one I loved most." Peace, when it finally came in 1174, was fragile. Henry pardoned his sons, a decision that would haunt him, while Eleanor wasn't so lucky. Captured attempting to reach Paris disguised as a man, she spent the next 15 years under house arrest, her influence broken but her legend only growing. The sons, meanwhile, learned all the wrong lessons. They saw that revolt worked, that their father's empire could be carved up through force. Richard would later turn on Henry again, allying with France's King Philip to bleed him dry in a grueling final campaign that ended only with the old king's death in 1189, abandoned by all but his bastard son Geoffrey. This bitter family war wasn't an aberration, it was a blueprint. The Plantagenets' fatal flaw wasn't ambition, but the way they nurtured it in their children. Each generation would repeat the cycle, fathers hoarding power, sons grasping for it, and mothers maneuvering in the shadows. The revolt of Henry's sons set a precedent that echoed through the centuries, culminating in the Wars of the Roses. Even the manner of their betrayals, broken oaths, shifting alliances, the cold calculus of power, would become hallmarks of Plantagenet rule. In the end, Henry's greatest failure wasn't losing battles, but creating heirs who believed loyalty was weaker than land, and that crowns were won not by inheritance but by steel. Richard the Lionheart stood as a legend in his own time, a golden-haired warrior whose name echoed through the courts of Europe and the deserts of Palestine. But for all his fame on the battlefield, Richard's reign over England was marked by one glaring truth. He barely ruled it at all. Crowned in 1189, he spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign on English soil. His heart belonged to the Crusades, to the great clash of civilizations in the Holy Land, not to the day-to-day governance of his father's kingdom. And while he carved his name into history as a chivalric hero back home, his absence left a throne ripe for chaos and a brother named John waiting in the wings. The Third Crusade drained England of more than just its king. Richard's campaign to retake Jerusalem bled the treasury dry. Taxes soared to fund his armies, with the Saladin tithe, a brutal levy of 1/4 of all movable wealth, leaving nobles and peasants alike groaning under the weight. But the real disaster came in 1192, when Richard was captured returning from the Holy Land. The ransom demanded by Emperor Henry VI of Germany was staggering, 100,000 marks, nearly 3 times England's annual revenue. To pay it, towns were taxed into poverty, churches stripped of their gold, and even the crown jewels melted down. The kingdom buckled under the strain, its coffers empty, its people exhausted. And through it all, Richard's brother John saw opportunity. While Richard fought in the Levant or languished in a German prison, John slithered into the gaps of power. He courted discontented barons, whispered promises to bishops, even struck secret deals with the French King Philip, Richard's greatest rival. When their mother, Eleanor, acted as regent to hold the realm together, John undermined her at every turn. He seized castles, forged alliances, and by the time Richard finally returned in 1194, England was less a kingdom than a patchwork of competing loyalties. The Lionheart had to spend the last years of his reign clawing back control, marching against rebel strongholds and buying off John's ambition with titles and lands. It was a costly game of catch-up, one that left the realm weaker than when he left. The irony of Richard's legacy is how little it matches reality. Songs and chronicles painted him as the perfect knight, brave, pious, and just. But the truth was far messier. He spoke barely a word of English, treated his kingdom as little more than a bank for foreign wars, and left it vulnerable to the very betrayals that would eventually unravel the Plantagenet Empire. When an arrow struck him down at the Siege of Challis in 1199, his death was almost poetic. A warrior king felled in a minor skirmish, his life spent not defending England but chasing glory abroad. His passing handed the crown to John the brother who had spent a lifetime waiting in the shadows, sharpening his knives, and the cracks Richard ignored would soon become chasms under a ruler far less charismatic and far more ruthless. The Lionheart's reign proved a dangerous lesson, that even the greatest legends could leave behind not strength but rot, and that no kingdom thrives when its king is forever looking beyond its shores. John Lackland inherited a kingdom already teetering on the edge, and with each passing year he pushed it closer to collapse. Unlike his brother Richard, who ignored England for glory abroad, John clung to his throne with a paranoid, grasping intensity. Yet for all his scheming, he couldn't prevent the single greatest humiliation of his reign, the loss of Normandy. In 1204, after years of failed campaigns and shifting alliances, French King Philip Augustus seized the ancestral homeland of the Plantagenets. The defeat wasn't just a military disaster. It severed England's umbilical cord to the continent, leaving John with the mocking title, Lackland, and a nobility furious at his incompetence. The barons' patience snapped when John demanded yet another tax to fund his doomed attempts to reclaim Normandy. These were men who'd watched their ancestors fight alongside William the Conqueror, who'd bled for Richard in the Holy Land, and now they were expected to bankroll failure after failure. But John's real undoing was his cruelty. He wasn't just a bad king, he was a sadistic one. Tales spread of him starving prisoners to death, pulling teeth for ransom, and allegedly murdering his own nephew Arthur with his bare hands. When the wife of a rebellious baron dared defy him, John reportedly had her and her son locked in a dungeon with a starving wild boar. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories cemented his reputation as a tyrant who ruled by terror. By 1215, the barons had enough. Led by Robert Fitzwalter, they marched on London under the banner of the Army of God, forcing John to meet them at Runnymede. There, on the banks of the Thames, they pressed a parchment into his hands, the Magna Carta. It wasn't the lofty declaration of rights we remember today, but a raw checklist of grievances: no arbitrary taxes, no imprisonment without trial, no selling widows to the highest bidder. John signed it under duress, seething as his royal prerogatives were stripped away. Within months, he convinced the Pope to annul it, plunging England into civil war. Yet the king's final humiliation came wrapped in legend. As he fled rebel forces in 1216, his baggage train, laden with the crown jewels and a lifetime of plundered wealth, supposedly vanished into the quicksands of the Wash estuary. Some said it was divine punishment, others whispered the treasure was stolen by his own men. John, sick with dysentery and rage, died days later at Newark Castle, leaving a 9-year-old heir and a kingdom in flames. The Magna Carta might have been born from baronial self-interest, but its legacy outlasted them all. Future generations would resurrect its clauses to challenge tyrannical kings, transforming a desperate peace treaty into the foundation of constitutional law. John's reign proved that even the most absolute power had limits, and that a crown weighed down by greed and fear could drag an entire dynasty into the mud. Henry III took the throne at just 9 years old, a boy king crowned amid the wreckage of his father's disastrous reign. England was still reeling from John's tyranny and the brutal civil war that followed, its treasury empty, its barons fractious, its borders vulnerable. For the next 16 years, the kingdom would be ruled not by Henry, but by a revolving cast of regents and power-hungry nobles who saw the child monarch as little more than a pawn in their games. This wasn't just a minority, it was a masterclass in how fragile royal authority could be when the crown rested on a head too young to bear its weight. The early years were a scramble for control. William Marshal, the aging knight who'd served 4 Plantagenet kings, stepped in as regent, propping up the young king with a mix of battlefield grit and political savvy. But even he couldn't prevent the barons from testing the limits of their power. The Magna Carta, once a desperate truce, became a weapon they wielded against the throne, demanding ever more concessions in exchange for their loyalty. When Marshal died in 1219, the fragile equilibrium shattered. Henry's guardians, men like Hubert de Burgh and Peter des Roches, spent more time feuding with each other than governing, while the barons grew bolder, carving out private fiefdoms under the guise of protecting the realm. By the time Henry finally took the reins in 1234, the damage was done. He'd spent his formative years watching his authority erode, and now he lacked the instinct to command it back. His court became a stage for favorites, especially his wife's Savoyard relatives and his own half-brothers from Poitou, whose lavish privileges alienated the English nobility. Worse, Henry had inherited his father's talent for picking fights he couldn't win. His obsession with reclaiming lost French territories drained the treasury, while his piety led him to pour fortunes into rebuilding Westminster Abbey, a project that struck many as vanity disguised as devotion. Then came Simon de Montfort, a man who would expose Henry's weaknesses like no other. Charismatic, ruthless, and married to the king's sister, de Montfort began as a loyalist but grew disgusted by Henry's mismanagement. He emerged as the barons' champion, framing their grievances not as rebellion but as reform. In 1258, they forced Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford, a radical blueprint that handed governance to a council of barons and effectively made the king a figurehead. For a fleeting moment, England teetered on the edge of becoming a republic in all but name. The inevitable clash came at Lewes in 1264. De Montfort's forces, though outnumbered, outmaneuvered Henry's army, capturing both the king and his heir, Prince Edward. For over a year, Henry became a puppet, his seal used to validate decrees he had no power to refuse. But de Montfort's triumph carried the seeds of its own undoing. His decision to summon knights and burgesses to his rebel parliament in 1265, a move historians now hail as a birth of representative government, also fractured his support. The barons hadn't fought to share power with commoners, and when Prince Edward escaped and rallied the royalists, the tide turned. The Battle of Evesham in 1265 was a slaughter. De Montfort's corpse was mutilated, his limbs sent to rebel towns as a warning. Henry, restored to his throne, would reign another 7 years, but he never truly ruled again. The real power passed to Edward, who'd learned from his father's mistakes and would forge a very different kind of kingship. Henry's legacy wasn't just his failures, but the unintended consequences they unleashed. The clashes of his reign proved that rebellion could be framed as reform, that parliaments could challenge kings, and that even the faintest hint of weakness in a Plantagenet ruler would summon wolves to the throne. Edward Longshanks earned his nickname not just for his towering height, but for the shadow he cast over Britain. When he took the throne in 1272, this was no hesitant ruler like his father Henry. Edward was a battle-hardened warrior with a vision to forge a united kingdom by fire and sword. His first target was Wales, where the fierce princes of Gwynedd had resisted English rule for generations. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, made the fatal mistake of underestimating Edward's resolve. What followed wasn't just a war, but an annihilation. Edward marched into Wales with an army trailed by the greatest siege engines Europe had ever seen, a towering trebuchet like the werewolf that could flatten castle walls in days. One by one, Welsh strongholds fell until Llewellyn was cornered and killed in an ambush near Builth Wells. His brother Dafydd lasted barely 6 months before being dragged to Shrewsbury, hanged, drawn, and quartered as a warning. But Edward wasn't content with mere conquest. He wanted to erase Welsh independence forever. In 1284, he began building an iron ring of castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, masterpieces of military engineering that doubled as symbols of domination. When Welsh nobles begged him to name a prince born in Wales who speaks no English, Edward famously presented them with his infant son, born just days earlier at Caernarfon. The message was clear: Wales would never rule itself again. Yet no sooner had Wales been subdued than Scotland erupted. What began as a dynastic dispute, the great cause over the vacant Scottish throne, became Edward's excuse to assert English overlordship. He handpicked John Balliol as a puppet king, but when the Scots resisted, Edward stormed Berwick in 1296, slaughtering thousands in streets running red with blood. The Stone of Destiny, Scotland's ancient coronation stone, was ripped from Scone Abbey and hauled to Westminster, but Edward hadn't counted on William Wallace. A minor landowner turned guerrilla leader, Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297 proved the English weren't invincible. Edward's revenge was swift and savage. At Falkirk the following year, his longbowmen cut Wallace's spearmen to pieces. Though Wallace would evade capture for years, his eventual fate, hanged, disemboweled, and beheaded, was meant to terrify Scotland into submission. The cost of these wars went far beyond bloodshed. Edward's campaigns drained the treasury at an alarming rate. To fund them, he taxed wool exports until merchants groaned, seized church silver, and even expelled England's Jewish population after squeezing them dry of loans. His legal reforms, though groundbreaking, standardizing common law, expanding Parliament's role, were often tools of control disguised as progress. The Statute of Winchester armed local communities to hunt rebels, while Quo Warranto inquiries forced nobles to prove their land titles or forfeit them to the crown. By the time Edward died in 1307, gasping orders for his son to boil his bones and carry them into battle against Scotland, he'd transformed England into a centralized state, but at what price? Wales was broken, Scotland simmered with hatred, and the royal coffers were empty. His wars created a template for future Plantagenets. That glory could be bought with other people's blood and gold. Yet the rebellions he sparked would outlive him, proving that no castle, no law, no act of brutality could extinguish the desire for freedom. Edward's reign stood as a paradox, the height of Plantagenet power and the beginning of its unraveling. Edward II never stood a chance at filling his father's iron boots. Where Edward Longshanks had been a warrior king forged in battle, his son was a man of softer passions, devoted to music, theatre, and most dangerously to his favourites. The first and most infamous was Piers Gaveston, a charismatic Gascon knight who'd grown up alongside Edward in the royal household. Their bond went far beyond friendship. Chroniclers sneered at their public displays of affection, how Gaveston wore the king's jewels, even how Edward embraced him with more than brotherly love. The barons, already wary of the new king's lack of military grit, watched in horror as Gaveston strutted through court, bestowing royal titles on himself and mocking the nobility with crude nicknames like Burst Belly for the Earl of Lincoln. The outrage reached its peak when Edward left Gaveston as regent while he sailed to France to marry Isabella, daughter of the French king. Returning to find her husband's lover effectively ruling England, the 12-year-old queen became a pawn in the growing storm. In 1311, the barons, led by Edward's own cousin Thomas of Lancaster, forced the king to banish Gaveston, only for Edward to recall him months later. Their patience snapped. Gaveston was captured, dragged to Warwick Castle, and executed on a nobleman's whim, his headless body left to rot until Edward finally recovered it for a tearful burial. But the lesson didn't stick. Within years, another favourite took Gaveston's place, Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man whose ambition outstripped even his predecessors. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant, Despenser was calculating, seizing lands through legal trickery and strong-arming his way into the king's innermost circle. His rise coincided with Edward's greatest humiliation, the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Facing Scotland's Robert the Bruce, Edward led a massive English army north, confident of avenging his father's campaigns. Instead, he walked into a slaughter. The English cavalry, trapped between marshes and Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, were butchered. Edward barely escaped, fleeing the field in such panic he abandoned his royal seal and nearly drowned crossing a river. The defeat shattered what little respect the barons still held for their king. As Despencer's grip tightened, even Queen Isabella turned against her husband. Sent to France on a diplomatic mission, she began an open affair with Roger Mortimer, a disgraced nobleman with a score to settle. Together, they raised an army and invaded England in 1326, finding the realm all too ready to abandon Edward. Despencer was captured, tortured, and hanged from a 50-foot gallows, his genitals carved off and burned before his eyes. Edward, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, became a ghost of a king. The official story claimed he died in 1327, but rumors swirled. Some said his jailers shoved a red-hot poker into his bowels, ensuring no visible wound. Others whispered he'd escaped, living out his days as a hermit in Europe. The truth may never be known, but one thing was certain: no Plantagenet king had ever fallen so far so fast. Edward II's reign exposed the fatal flaw of personal loyalty over politics. His inability to balance favorites with the demands of rulership didn't just cost him his throne, it nearly destroyed the kingdom itself. Yet from this chaos emerged an unexpected victor, his son, Edward III, who would watch, learn, and vow never to repeat his father's mistakes. The stage was set for a king who understood that love, unchecked by power, could be as deadly as any sword. Isabella and Mortimer's grip on England felt unshakable, until the boy they'd underestimated decided to play their own game. After Edward II's gruesome downfall, Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer ruled as regents in the name of her teenage son, Edward III. But this wasn't a partnership of equals. Mortimer, hungry for the power he'd long been denied, treated the realm like a plundered chest. He awarded himself lavish estates, manipulated royal decrees, and even staged a sham trial to execute Edward II's half-brother, the Earl of Kent, on trumped-up charges. The nobility seethed, watching as Mortimer strutted through court in robes trimmed with imperial purple, a color reserved for kings alone. Isabella, once the betrayed wife who rallied an invasion to free England from her husband's misrule, now turned a blind eye to Mortimer's excesses. The she-wolf of France, as chroniclers called her, had become a puppet in her lover's ambitions. Together, they bled the treasury dry, raising taxes to fund Mortimer's private wars in Wales and Ireland. Their most brazen act came in 1328, when they forced 14-year-old Edward III to sign the humiliating Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, surrendering English claims to Scotland, a direct insult to his grandfather Edward Longshank's legacy. The young king's signature on that parchment was the moment he began plotting his revenge. Edward waited with the patience of a falcon circling its prey. By late 1330, Mortimer's arrogance had alienated even Isabella's allies. Sensing the shift, Edward secretly gathered a band of loyal knights, including his childhood friend William Montagu. The plan unfolded like a scene from a chivalric romance. On the night of October 19th, Montagu and his men slipped through a hidden tunnel into Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella held court. The Queen screamed as armed men burst into her chambers, but Mortimer's guards were already disarmed, bribed, or overpowered by Edward's supporters. Dragged kicking and cursing from the room, Mortimer's reign ended as abruptly as it began. His trial was a mere formality. Stripped of his stolen titles, Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn like a common thief, his corpse left twisting in the wind for 2 days as a warning. Isabella, spared execution but stripped of power, spent her remaining years under comfortable house arrest, her political influence extinguished. The speed of their downfall revealed the fatal miscalculation they'd made, believing a Plantagenet prince would remain forever in their shadow. On the morning of his 18th birthday, Edward III rode into London not as a boy king, but as a sovereign ready to reclaim his birthright. And the Plantagenet dynasty would never be the same again. Edward III didn't just want England, he believed France was his birthright. Through his mother, Isabella, he claimed descent from the Capetian kings, a lineage the French nobility had conveniently ignored when they crowned Philip VI instead. What began as a diplomatic spat over Gascony's borders soon escalated into something far grander, a royal gamble that would ignite the 100 Years' War. In 1340, Edward formally declared himself the rightful king of France, quartering the golden lilies of the French coat of arms with England's lions. It wasn't just a challenge, it was an insult that reshaped European politics for generations. The early years of the war read like a Plantagenet revenge fantasy. At Crecy in 1346, Edward's outnumbered army faced Philip's glittering host of armored knights. What the French saw as an easy victory turned into slaughter. English longbowmen, trained from childhood to draw bows with the force of a modern rifle, unleashed storms of arrows that punched through steel plate like parchment. When the surviving French knights floundered through muddy fields in their retreat, English men-at-arms butchered them at leisure. Chroniclers wrote of princes dying with their horses atop them, suffocating in the muck. Edward's 16-year-old son, the Black Prince, earned his spurs that day, and the lesson wasn't lost on him. Discipline and technology could humble even the mightiest feudal host. A decade later at Poitiers, the Black Prince proved he'd learned his father's lessons too well. Trapped against a wooded hillside with exhausted troops, he turned certain defeat into another stupendous victory. French King John II was captured, hauled back to London in chains, and paraded through the streets like a trophy. The ransom demanded for his release, 3 million gold crowns, was enough to bankrupt France twice over. For a fleeting moment, Edward's dream of a dual monarchy seemed within reach. But war wasn't just battles and glory, it was a hungry beast that devoured England from within. To fund these campaigns, Edward bled his kingdom dry. The wool trade, England's lifeblood, was taxed until merchants groaned. Parliament, once a reluctant partner, became a permanent fixture as Edward bartered privileges for war subsidies. Even the church wasn't spared. Its silver altars melted down to mint coins, and then came the plague. The Black Death of 1348 didn't just kill half the population, it shattered the feudal economy. With laborers scarce, wages soared, and Edward's government scrambled to freeze them at pre-plague levels with the Statute of Laborers. The unrest that followed would simmer for decades, culminating in the Peasants' Revolt. The war also reshaped English identity in unexpected ways. Soldiers who'd fought in France brought back not just plunder, but a new sense of nationalism. English, once the crude tongue of peasants, began displacing French as the language of court and law. When Edward founded the Order of the Garter, its motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, was tellingly in French, but its spirit was unmistakably English, a chivalric brotherhood bound by loyalty to the crown, not continental feudal ties. By the time Edward died in 1377, the war had become a family tradition. The Black Prince predeceased him, leaving the throne to a 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, who would inherit not just a crown, but the impossible burden of finishing what his grandfather started. Edward's victories had bought England an empire, but empires are costly to hold. The shimmering dream of a Plantagenet France would soon tarnish, revealing the grim truth. That war, once unleashed, is easier to start than to stop. And the lessons of Crecy and Poitiers, that skill could triumph over numbers, would haunt the English when the tables turned, and they found themselves the outnumbered underdogs in a conflict with no end in sight. The Black Prince was everything a Plantagenet king should be: charismatic, battle-hardened, and fiercely loyal to his father's vision. From his teenage triumph at Crecy to his masterful victory at Poitiers, he embodied the warrior king ideal. But by the time he reached his 30s, something was wrong. The man who'd once ridden through France like a force of nature now struggled to mount his horse without assistance. The illness, likely dysentery contracted during his Spanish campaign, or perhaps a form of cancer, wasted him slowly, turning the Lion of England into a hollowed-out shadow. Chroniclers wrote of his once bright eyes dulled by pain, his body racked with fevers even as his mind remained sharp, and with every labored breath, the future of the Plantagenet dynasty grew more uncertain. His death in 1376, just 1 year before his father's, wasn't merely tragic, it was catastrophic for the realm. All those years of grooming, all those battles fought to secure his legacy, meant nothing in the end. The crown would skip a generation, passing not to the tested warrior prince, but to his 10-year-old son, Richard II, a boy who'd grown up not on battlefields, but in the sheltered luxury of court, surrounded by sycophants and scholars. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where the Black Prince led charges, Richard wrote poetry. Where his father understood the brutal calculus of war, the young king would see only the divine right of kings. The ripple effects of this premature death reshaped England. Edward III, grief-stricken and aging, had little time to prepare his grandson for the throne. The old king's final years were spent watching his hard-won French territories slip away, knowing the boy who'd inherit them lacked the steel to hold them. The Black Prince might have preserved his father's empire. Richard would lose it. Worse still, the prince's absence left a power vacuum filled by ambitious uncles. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, became the puppet master behind the throne, his own eyes fixed on the crown his brother would never wear. Imagine an alternate history where the Black Prince survived. Would England have plunged into the chaos of the peasants' revolt under a king who'd earned his men's loyalty in battle? Would the French have dared reclaim Aquitaine if Edward's heir still rode at the head of an army? The tragedy isn't just that he died young. It's that his death robbed England of the ruler it desperately needed at its most vulnerable moment. Instead of a seasoned commander, the throne got a child. Instead of stability, the Plantagenets got civil war. The Black Prince's greatest legacy wasn't his victories, it was the disaster his absence made inevitable. Richard II inherited a crown he was never prepared to wear. A boy of 10 thrust onto the throne after the Black Prince's untimely death, surrounded by scheming uncles and a nobility still bloodied from the 100 Years' War. His reign began not with celebration but with quiet dread. Those early years under regency councils taught him one brutal lesson: trust no one. By the time he shook off his advisors' control in 1389, the once promising king had hardened into something far darker. A ruler who saw enemies in every shadow and believed divine right placed him above earthly consequences. The first true test came with the Lords Appellant, a faction of powerful nobles led by his own uncle, Thomas of Woodstock. Outraged by Richard's lavish spending and reliance on low-born favorites like Robert de Vere, they seized control in 1387, purging his court in what became known as the Merciless Parliament. For a year, the adolescent king could only watch as his closest allies were executed or exiled. The humiliation festered in him like a wound. When he finally regained power, his revenge was meticulous. One by one, the Lords Appellant found themselves stripped of lands, titles, even their lives. Woodstock was smuggled to Calais and quietly smothered in a dungeon. His body returned to England wrapped in lead, a warning disguised as a royal funeral. But Richard's paranoia didn't stop with his enemies. He surrounded himself with a private army of Cheshire archers, their badges of the White Hart, a symbol of unquestioning loyalty. He demanded subjects kiss his hands and knees as if he were a living saint, and reportedly commissioned a portrait of himself enthroned like Christ, golden and untouchable. The final provocation came in 1397 with the murder of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke's exiled father, John of Gaunt. When Richard seized Gaunt's vast Lancastrian estates, lands rightfully belonging to Henry, he crossed a line even medieval kings feared to tread. Confiscating inheritance wasn't just tyranny, it shattered the feudal contract that bound nobles to their monarch. Bolingbroke's return from exile that summer wasn't an invasion, it was an avalanche. Abandoned by nobles who'd tolerated his excesses but wouldn't defend his thefts, Richard found himself cornered in Conway Castle. His surrender was orchestrated like a theatrical tragedy, complete with a forced abdication scripted to absolve Parliament of regicide. The deposition ceremony itself was a masterstroke of political theatre, Richard, pale and trembling, reciting his failures as his crown was literally pried from his hands. His death in Pontefract Castle the following year was shrouded in purposeful mystery. Officially, he starved himself in despair, but few believed a king who'd once dined on peacock and swan would choose such an end. Whispers spread of assassins, of a handkerchief pressed over his face as he slept. Henry IV, newly crowned, made no effort to disprove them. The implications rippled across Europe. For centuries, kings were seen as God's anointed, their persons inviolate, their rule sacred. Richard's downfall proved otherwise. If a Plantagenet could be toppled by his own cousin, what stopped every disgruntled noble from trying the same? The Wars of the Roses, when they came decades later, were born in this single act of broken taboo. Richard's reign became a cautionary tale. That divine right meant nothing without the strength to back it up, and that no king, no matter how absolute, was truly untouchable. Henry IV seized a crown he couldn't enjoy, a usurper's prize that burned in his hands from the moment he claimed it. His coup against Richard II wasn't just a political gamble. It shattered an unspoken sacred rule, that kings ruled by divine right, not popular appeal. The very nobles who helped him to power now watched him with wary eyes, waiting for the moment their loyalty might be rewarded, or their throats cut. Within months of his coronation in 1399, whispers spread that Richard, locked in Pontefract Castle, still lived. And when those whispers turned to outright rebellion, Henry learned the true cost of his ambition. The first revolt came swift as a dagger thrust. In 1400, a coalition of disgruntled nobles, many of them former allies, backed a bizarre plot to restore Richard. The problem: Richard was almost certainly already dead. Undeterred, the rebels paraded a look-alike through the streets, hoping to spark popular fury. Henry crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency, executing its leaders in ways designed to terrify. Some hanged, drawn, and quartered, others burned alive as traitors. But the message backfired. Instead of cowing dissent, the bloodshed painted Henry as a tyrant clinging to stolen power. Worse still, the treasury was empty. Years of Richard's extravagance and the collapse of the French war effort left England's coffers hollowed out. Henry's solution, confiscating church lands, earned him excommunication threats from Rome, while his heavy-handed taxes turned merchants and peasants alike against him. Even his victories came at a price. The Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where he faced down the Percy family's rebellion, was a Pyrrhic triumph. His own son, the future Henry V, took an arrow to the face leading the charge, surviving only through a surgeon's gruesome improvisation with honey and alcohol. The king himself fought like a demon, his armor hacked and dented, but the physical toll deepened the shadow over his reign. Then came the illness. Historians still debate its nature. Some say leprosy, others a stroke disorder, perhaps even syphilis. Whatever its source, Henry's body betrayed him. His skin ulcerated, his limbs trembled, and by 1405 he could barely walk without assistance. Courtiers described horrific episodes where he would collapse mid-sentence, his eyes rolling back as foam gathered on his lips. The timing couldn't have been worse. With Wales in open revolt under Owain Glyndwr and the French taunting his weakness, Henry's deteriorating health became a political crisis. Rumors spread that God had cursed him for Richard's murder, and even his closest advisors began eyeing his 15-year-old son as a safer bet. His final years were a grim parody of kingship. By 1413, he was a ghost of himself, wheeled into Parliament on a litter, his speech slurred, his authority leaching away to his rivals. When death finally took him in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster, it was almost a mercy, but the damage was done. Henry's reign proved that usurpation came with a curse, the constant dread of being toppled by the next ambitious noble. He'd broken the spell of divine right, and in doing so planted the seeds for the Wars of the Roses. The question was no longer who ruled England, but how many blades it would take to hold the throne. His son, Henry V, would learn that lesson all too well, and his victories would only delay the reckoning his father's actions had set in motion. Henry V rode to war like a man with something to prove, not just to France but to England itself. His father's reign had been shadowed by rebellion and doubt, the crown forever tainted by usurpation. Young Henry needed a victory so dazzling it would make the nation forget his family's bloody rise to power, and at Agincourt in 1415 he got it. Outnumbered 5-1, his army starving and sick with dysentery, he faced the flower of French chivalry across a muddy killing field. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre in the rain. English longbowmen, their arrows cutting through steel like parchment, turned the field into a quagmire of drowning knights. By day's end, thousands of French nobles lay dead, their bodies piled like cordwood. Henry, his surcoat spattered with blood, knelt in the mud to give thanks not just for victory, but for the divine favor that would finally legitimize his rule. But Agincourt was only the beginning. Over the next 5 years, Henry methodically conquered Normandy, besieging castles with the cold precision of a chess player. At Rouen in 1419, he starved 30,000 civilians into surrender, letting them starve outside the walls rather than weaken his siege lines. His ruthlessness had a purpose. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, where a broken France recognized him as heir to the throne. He married Catherine of Valois, binding the two kingdoms in blood, and for a fleeting moment the Plantagenet dream of a dual monarchy seemed real. Yet the cost of glory was hidden in the ledger books. The war drained England's coffers, and Henry's insistence on leading every campaign took a grim toll. In 1422, just 2 years after his triumph at Troyes, he lay dying of dysentery in a drafty French castle, barely 35 years old. His last words, whispered to his brothers, were a warning: protect his 9-month-old son, Henry VI, but no amount of protection could shield the boy from the truth. Infant kings were lightning rods for disaster, and the nobles who'd cheered Henry V's conquests now eyed each other like wolves circling a wounded deer. The cruelest twist of Henry's legacy was how quickly it curdled. His battlefields became nursery rhymes, his name a byword for English valor, but the empire he built was a house of cards. Without his iron grip, Normandy unraveled within a generation, and his son's reign would spiral into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. The very thing that made Henry great, his single-minded pursuit of glory, sowed the seeds of his dynasty's collapse. He'd united England through war, but left it no lasting peace, and in the silence after the trumpets faded, the question lingered: was it worth it to conquer a kingdom, only to hand your child a crown too heavy to hold? Henry VI inherited a double crown, England and France, but none of the steel needed to hold them. A gentle, pious boy raised on Latin psalms rather than swordplay, he was crowned at just 9 months old, his infancy a battleground for rival uncles. By the time he took power in 1437, the kingdom expected a ruler molded by his warrior father's legacy. Instead, they got a king who preferred founding schools to leading armies, who wept at the sight of bloodshed, and whose greatest joy was translating religious texts by candlelight. His very virtues, compassion, humility, devotion, made him lethally unsuited for the brutal game of medieval kingship. The first cracks appeared in 1453. After decades of losing France Jeanne d'Arc's campaigns, the fall of Normandy, Henry suffered a complete mental collapse. For over a year, he could not speak, recognize friends, or even lift his head. Courtiers whispered of divine punishment, of a king so holy he'd been granted visions that shattered his mind. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, became the realm's de facto ruler, but her sharp intellect and French roots only deepened noble resentment. When Henry finally awoke from his stupor in 1454, He was a changed man, passive, easily swayed, signing documents without reading them as factions fought for control of his seal. Supernatural rumors swirled like fog around the broken king. Some claimed he'd been cursed by his grandfather's sin, the murder of Richard II. Others swore he had the power to heal the sick, pointing to his miraculous recovery of a possessed child during a pilgrimage. Pilgrims touched his robes for blessings, while nobles scoffed that England needed a warrior, not a saint. Meanwhile, the kingdom fractured. Richard, Duke of York, Henry's own cousin, began positioning himself as the strong hand the realm desperately needed. When Henry slipped into another catatonic episode in 1455, York was named protector, ruling with an efficiency that made the king's weakness all the more glaring. The return of Henry's faculties in 1456 didn't bring stability. It lit the fuse for civil war. York, forced to relinquish power, now saw the throne as his by right of competence. The Queen, fiercely protective of her infant son's inheritance, rallied the Lancastrian loyalists. By 1460, the first blood was spilled at Northampton, where Henry was captured like a relic, sitting quietly under a tree as his defenders died around him. The Wars of the Roses had begun, not because men craved a new king, but because the old one could not be won. Henry's final years were a tragic epilogue. Briefly restored in 1470, he was little more than a figurehead, his hollow eyes watching as the factions he'd failed to control tore England apart. His death in the Tower of London, officially from melancholy, though few doubted murder, was the quiet end of a man who'd never wanted power, only peace. In death, he became a martyr for some, his tomb at Windsor a site of miracles, but for the Plantagenets, his reign was the reckoning, proof that in a world built by swords, a king who refused to wield one would always be the first to fall. The stage was set not by a single grievance, but by decades of festering resentment between two branches of the Plantagenet tree, one wearing the white rose of York, the other the red rose of Lancaster. At its heart, the conflict wasn't just about crowns or laws, but a question that had haunted England since Henry IV's usurpation: what made a king legitimate? Was it divine right, as the Lancastrians claimed through their direct line from John of Gaunt, or was it competence, as the Yorkists argued, pointing to Henry VI's disastrous reign? What began as a political squabble over royal advisors soon spiraled into something far darker, a generations-long blood feud where vengeance mattered more than victory. The first true clash came in 1455 at St. Albans, a battle so small it barely lasted an hour but changed everything. Richard of York, backed by the powerful Neville family, marched on the king's encampment under the pretense of removing evil counsellors. But when Henry refused to surrender his favorites, the Yorkist forces stormed the town's narrow streets. Arrows hissed from rooftops, and in the chaos, Lancastrian leaders fell like targets in a hunt. The king's loyal commander, the Duke of Somerset, was hacked to death outside a tavern, while Henry himself was nicked by an arrow and left sitting dazed under a banner, his robes splattered with someone else's blood. The Yorkists won, but their triumph came at a cost. Now they'd crossed the line from protest to rebellion, and the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, would never forgive them. Margaret became the Lancastrian flame, fierce, relentless, and utterly unconcerned with the rules of chivalry. While Henry drifted between prayer and paralysis, she raised armies in the north, offering pardons to outlaws if they'd fight for her son's birthright. Her enemies painted her as a she-wolf, a foreign harpy manipulating a feeble king. But Margaret understood what Richard of York did not. In this new war, mercy was weakness. When York temporarily seized power as protector, she bided her time, waiting until his overreach alienated even his allies. By 1459, she'd engineered his downfall, forcing him to swear allegiance to Henry in a humiliating ceremony where he had to kneel like a penitent child. Yet the peace lasted barely a year. In 1460, York struck back, this time with a bolder claim not just to rule, but to replace Henry entirely. Parliament's Act of Accord declared York heir to the throne, disinheriting Margaret's young son. The Queen's response was pure fury. Rallying northern lords who despised York's southern arrogance, she marched an army of hardened borderers south. At Wakefield, she set a trap, luring York out of his castle with false promises of negotiation. Her forces ambushed him in the open. The Duke died fighting, but the real horror came after. His severed head, crowned with a paper diadem, was impaled on the gates of York, a grotesque joke fit for a would-be king. Wakefield changed the game. This was no longer a squabble over governance, it was annihilation. York's son, Edward, now took up the cause with a ruthlessness his father had lacked. Just months later at Towton in 1461, the two factions met in a blizzard so thick soldiers later claimed they fought blind. 28,000 men butchered each other in the snow, the Lancastrian line collapsing as their retreat turned into a slaughter on the icy River Cock. Edward, barely 19, watched as the fleeing nobles were cut down in droves, their bodies later found piled 5 deep in the ravine locals called Bloody Meadow. The Wars of the Roses weren't dynastic chess, they were personal. Every turn was fueled by betrayals that cut deeper than politics. When Warwick the Kingmaker, the architect of York's early victories later, switched sides to Margaret after Edward spurned his diplomatic marriage plans, it wasn't about crowns. It was about humiliation. When Edward's own brother George conspired with the Lancastrians, it wasn't for power. It was because Edward had always been their mother's favorite. The Plantagenets, once Europe's most formidable dynasty, were now a family tearing itself apart. One grudge, one battle, one severed head at a time. Edward IV burst onto the throne like a force of nature, tall, golden-haired, and radiating the kind of charisma that made men flock to his banner without question. At just 18, he'd inherited his father's claim to the crown, but none of his caution. The Battle of Towton in 1461 was his masterpiece. In howling snow so thick that men fought blind, Edward led the Yorkist charge against a Lancastrian army 3 times their size. The slaughter lasted 10 hours, the fields turning to crimson slush as the Yorkist archers used the wind to their advantage, their arrows slicing through the storm while the Lancastrians fell short. By dusk, the river ran red with the blood of fleeing soldiers, their bodies piled so high they formed grisly dams. When the dust settled, Henry VI fled to Scotland, and England had a new king, one who believed victory was his divine right. But Edward's early reign was less about governance and more about survival. The Lancastrians still held pockets of resistance, and his own allies were already eyeing his throne. His greatest asset was his magnetism, a rare gift for making even enemies feel like honored guests. He hosted lavish tournaments, feasted with merchants as readily as nobles, and could drink any man under the table while still issuing sharp-eyed decrees at dawn. Yet for all his charm, Edward harbored a reckless streak. In 1464, he made a decision that would haunt his reign, a secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful widow with no royal blood but a web of ambitious relatives. The scandal wasn't just that she was common-born, it was that Edward had spurned a strategic alliance with France, humiliating his own advisor, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick, known as the Kingmaker for his role in placing Edward on the throne, saw the marriage as a personal betrayal. He'd spent years negotiating a French match to secure England's borders, only to have the king throw it all away for a woman whose family now clamored for titles and land. The Woodvilles' rapid rise was a slap in the face to the old nobility. Elizabeth's brother married the Duchess of Bedford overnight, her son from a previous union wed to the heiress of Exeter. Warwick wasn't just angry, he was terrified. A king who acted on passion, not politics, was a king who could topple the delicate balance of power. Edward's response to the growing unrest was typical. He doubled down. When Warwick and his brother George, the Duke of Clarence, rebelled in 1469, Edward crushed them with the same audacity he'd shown at Towton. But his victory came at a cost. The kingmaker slipped away to France, where he struck a deal with Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen. The unthinkable had happened. The man who'd made Edward king now vowed to destroy him. And in 1470, Warwick returned with an army, forcing Edward to flee to Burgundy, while Henry VI, half mad and broken, was paraded through London as a puppet monarch. Edward's first reign ended as dramatically as it began, but the Lion of York wasn't finished yet. His exile lasted mere months before he roared back, landing in Yorkshire with a handful of loyalists and a borrowed army. The stage was set for a reckoning not just between York and Lancaster, but between a king who ruled by charm and the noble who'd learned too late that kings could be unmade as easily as they were crowned. Edward's story was far from over, but his early reign had already rewritten the rules. In a world where bloodlines and battlefields decided fates, he'd proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapon a king could wield wasn't a sword, it was sheer, irresistible will. Warwick the Kingmaker's betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. For years, he'd been the architect of Edward IV's rise, the puppet master who pulled the strings of England's throne. But when Edward married Elizabeth Woodville against Warwick's carefully laid plans, the Earl's pride curdled into fury. The final straw came when Edward blocked Warwick's attempts to forge alliances through marriage, snubbing his diplomatic efforts with France and Burgundy. The Kingmaker had built his legacy on placing kings on the throne now. He'd prove he could remove one just as easily. The web of betrayals that followed was as tangled as it was ruthless. Warwick found an unlikely ally in Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, a man whose jealousy of the king's favoritism toward their youngest brother, Richard, twisted into treason. Together, Warwick and Clarence stoked rebellion in the north, spreading rumors of Edward's illegitimacy and Woodville greed. When Edward marched to suppress the unrest, he walked into a trap. Warwick's forces, reinforced by secret Lancastrian sympathizers, turned the king's own army against him. Cornered and outmaneuvered, Edward was forced to flee in the dead of night, escaping across the Channel to Burgundy with little more than the clothes on his back and a handful of loyal knights. The psychological blow was staggering. Edward, who'd always radiated invincibility, now faced the unthinkable exile. For a man who'd won his crown at 19 on the battlefield, the humiliation of depending on foreign charity cut deeper than any sword. Chroniclers wrote of his restless pacing in Burgundian castles, his outbursts of frustration alternating with chilling silence. Meanwhile, Warwick executed his masterstroke. He dragged Henry VI from the Tower, where he'd been living in half-mad solitude, and paraded him through London like a resurrected ghost. The spectacle was meant to shock the broken Lancastrian king, his robes hanging loose on his gaunt frame, propped up as Warwick's puppet. But Warwick's triumph was built on quicksand. His alliance with Margaret of Anjou, Henry's exiled queen, was a marriage of convenience that satisfied no one. The Lancastrians despised him as a turncoat, while Clarence, realizing Warwick's promises of power were empty, began to waver. The realm, still reeling from Edward's sudden fall, chafed under Warwick's heavy-handed rule. Taxes soared, trade withered, and whispers spread that the Kingmaker's ambition had overreached its limits. Edward, watching from afar, sensed the cracks. His exile wasn't defeat, it was a gambit. With Burgundy's support, he bided his time, waiting for the moment Warwick's web of alliances would fray. And when it did, he'd return not as a fugitive but as a storm. The Lion of York had been caged, but claws grew back sharper in the dark. Edward IV didn't return to England. He erupted back into it like a storm. Landing in Yorkshire in 1471 with a borrowed Burgundian army barely large enough to fill a barn, he should have been doomed. But Edward understood something Warwick had forgotten. Charisma could rally men faster than any decree. Marching south under banners declaring his loyalty to Henry VI, a masterstroke of psychological warfare, he gathered followers like a snowball rolling downhill. City gates swung open without a fight, defectors flocked to his camp, and by the time he reached Coventry, even his traitorous brother Clarence slithered back to his side, bribed with promises of forgiveness. Warwick, holed up behind the walls, could only watch as his grand design unraveled. The showdown came at Barnet on a fog-shrouded Easter morning. Edward's forces, outnumbered and exhausted from a night march, attacked at dawn through mist so thick they couldn't see their own banners. Chaos ruled the field. Warwick's Lancastrian allies accidentally fired into their own lines, mistaking Oxford's star badges for Edward's sunbursts. As the confusion spiraled, Edward did what he did best. He led the charge straight into the heart of the melee. Warwick, the master strategist who'd spent a lifetime pulling strings from the shadows, died like a common soldier, his throat pierced by an arrow as he fled on foot. The Kingmaker's corpse was stripped naked and displayed in London's St. Paul's Cathedral, a grotesque warning to anyone who dared challenge the sun in splendor. But the war wasn't over yet. Margaret of Anjou, finally returned from exile, had landed in the West with her 17-year-old son, Prince Edward. The Lancastrian queen moved like a woman possessed, rallying the last of her loyalists for one final throw of the dice. Edward, ever relentless, gave her no time to breathe. Covering 37 miles in a single day's forced march, an unheard-of feat, he cornered her at Tewkesbury. The battle was a slaughter. The Lancastrian vanguard broke against Edward's disciplined ranks, their commander drowned in a millpond while fleeing. Prince Edward, cut down in the rout, died begging for mercy that never came. As for Margaret, she was found hours later hiding in a nearby abbey, her screams echoing through the cloisters as they dragged her away. The House of Lancaster wasn't just defeated, it was extinguished. Victory should have meant peace, but Edward had learned the cost of mercy. His second reign was a darker, sharper creature than the first. The old charm remained, but beneath it pulsed a new ruthlessness. Henry VI, imprisoned in the Tower for years, conveniently died the night Edward returned to London, his skull allegedly crushed with a red-hot poker. The remaining Lancastrian claimants vanished into shallow graves or foreign convents. Even Edward's own family wasn't safe. Clarence, whose betrayal had been forgiven at Barnet, grew restless again, his drunken rants about the king's illegitimacy a growing liability. In 1478, Edward gave the order. Clarence was hauled before a packed parliament, convicted of treason, and, according to legend, drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, a macabre joke about his notorious alcoholism. The irony of Edward's second reign was that its very stability depended on increasingly unstable methods. He ruled through a combination of terror and theatrics, staging lavish tournaments to distract from the executions. The treasury swelled with confiscated Lancastrian lands, while the royal court became a glittering gilded cage where nobles were pampered into compliance. Yet for all his tightening grip, Edward couldn't control one thing: time. By his early 40s, the once vibrant king had grown bloated and lethargic, his legendary stamina sapped by feasts and drink. When he collapsed suddenly in April 1483, likely from a stroke, England was left with a 12-year-old heir and a web of rivalries held together only by Edward's fading charisma. His death didn't just create a power vacuum, it exposed the fatal flaw of his reign. Edward had spent years centralizing authority in his own person, trusting no one but his immediate circle. The Woodvilles, hated by the old nobility, now controlled the boy King Edward V. The Duke of Gloucester, the king's loyal younger brother, watched from the north with growing unease. And the Lancastrian exiles, though scattered, still whispered the name of their last hope, Henry Tudor, a forgotten claimant skulking in Brittany. The stage was set not for a continuation of Yorkist glory, but for a reckoning, one that would prove even the sun in splendor could be eclipsed. The Tower of London in 1483 should have been a place of preparation, not prison. 12-year-old Edward V arrived there in May, awaiting what should have been a glorious coronation. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had sworn to protect him, yet within weeks, the boy king and his younger brother Richard vanished from history's gaze. The whispers started almost immediately. Two small figures glimpsed playing in the tower's garden one day, gone the next. No graves, no ransom demands, just a chilling silence that would haunt England for centuries. At the heart of this mystery stood Richard III, the man who benefited most from their disappearance and whose reputation would never recover from the shadow of their absence. The timing was damning. Just days after the boys were last seen, Richard declared their parents' marriage invalid, rendering the princes illegitimate and himself the rightful king. Parliament rubber-stamped his claim with shocking haste, and by July he wore the crown that should have belonged to his nephew. Noble families who might have protested suddenly found themselves facing treason charges or falling mysteriously ill. Even the prince's own mother, Elizabeth Woodville, emerged from sanctuary after months of resistance, a surrender that fueled speculation she'd been shown proof her sons were already dead. Richard's defenders argued he had no need to kill the boys. Their illegitimacy sufficed to secure his throne. But in an age where live claimants were walking targets, mercy was a luxury few kings could afford. Centuries of debate haven't settled the truth. Thomas More's vivid account, written under the Tudor regime that overthrew Richard, painted a ghoulish scene of smothered pillows and hired assassins. Yet More's sources were dubious at best, including confessions allegedly extracted under torture. The discovery of two small skeletons beneath a tower staircase in 1674 seemed to confirm the worst, but modern science raises new questions. The bones, never DNA tested, show signs of spinal deformity inconsistent with Edward's known athleticism. Some historians point to other suspects, Henry Tudor's agents, desperate to erase rival claimants before Bosworth, or even rogue Lancastrians seeking to frame Richard. The real tragedy isn't just the fate of the princes, it's how their disappearance poisoned Richard's reign before it truly began. Each rebellion he crushed, each ally he rewarded, was viewed through the lens of that original sin. When his only son died suddenly in 1484, many saw it as divine retribution. By the time Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in 1485, Richard's support had eroded like sand beneath his feet. The vanished boys became his unwitting executioners, their ghosts rallying more soldiers against him than Tudor swords ever could. Recent discoveries add fresh layers to the enigma. In 2012, archaeologists unearthed Richard's own skeleton under a Leicester parking lot, his twisted spine fueling debates about whether Shakespeare's hunchbacked villain was slander or truth. Meanwhile, petitions persist to test the tower bones, though the Crown refuses, citing respect for the dead. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to endure, their power lying not in answers, but in the endless questions they provoke. The princes in the tower remain history's most haunting cold case, a riddle wrapped in royal velvet and stained with the blood of a dynasty's collapse. Richard III's reign was a paradox wrapped in vengeance and reform, a king who ruled for only 2 years but left a mark so deep England would never forget him. From the moment he seized the crown in 1483, Richard faced an impossible choice: prove himself a just ruler or succumb to the paranoia that came with a stolen throne. His early actions hinted at surprising nobility. He passed laws banning the seizure of goods without trial, promoted fair taxes, and even established the court of request so the poor could sue their oppressors. These reforms weren't mere gestures, they cut against the corruption festering in England's courts, earning him admiration from commoners who'd long suffered under noble whims. But goodwill couldn't erase the whispers. Every reform was shadowed by the specter of those vanished princes, their absence a void no policy could fill. The Tudor machine wasted no time painting Richard as a monster. Shakespeare's hunchbacked tyrant plotting murders with a withered arm and a poet's cruelty was fiction, but it stuck. The real Richard was a complex figure, a battle-hardened administrator with a limp from scoliosis, not the theatrical villain of stage. Yet even without Tudor slander, his reign was fraught with violence. The execution of his former ally, Lord Hastings, dragged from a council meeting and beheaded without trial, revealed a king who trusted no one. When the Duke of Buckingham, once his staunchest supporter, raised a rebellion, Richard crushed it with a fury that bordered on desperation. Each suppression tightened his grip but alienated more nobles until even the weather seemed to conspire against him. The summer of 1485 brought freak storms, interpreted as divine wrath for his sins. Bosworth Field was less a battle than a reckoning. When Henry Tudor landed with his ragged band of exiles, Richard's forces should have overwhelmed them. But betrayal ran thick in the morning mist. The Stanley family, promised gold and titles by Tudor, held back their troops until the pivotal moment. Richard, spotting Henry's banner across the field, made a gamble worthy of his brother Edward, a direct charge to end the war in one stroke. His cavalry thundered downhill, his personal guard cutting a bloody path toward Tudor. For a heartbeat, it nearly worked. Henry's standard-bearer fell, his banner trampled into the mud. Then the Stanleys struck. Richard's horse bogged down in the marsh, his knights were swarmed, and the last Plantagenet king died screaming for a fresh mount, his crown rolling into a thorn bush. The aftermath was a masterclass in propaganda. Tudor historians painted Richard's death as cosmic justice, his body stripped and paraded like a common thief. Yet modern discoveries complicate the tale. Richard's rediscovered skeleton in 2012 revealed severe battle injuries, 8 head wounds, including a brutal cleave to the skull, but also careful burial with his hands bound, a quiet dignity at odds with Tudor accounts. His legacy remains suspended between two extremes, the ruthless usurper who murdered children and the innovative ruler betrayed by circumstance. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. Richard was a man of his time, brilliant and brutal, pious and paranoid, who understood that in the Game of Thrones, mercy often meant suicide. His tragedy wasn't just his fall, but how thoroughly the victors rewrote his story, turning a king into a cautionary tale for the ages. Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne was so tenuous it barely existed at all. A half-Welsh exile raised in the damp castles of Brittany, he spent his youth as little more than a pawn in continental power games, his lineage a footnote to the Wars of the Roses. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was descended from John of Gaunt's illegitimate line, a connection so diluted it hardly warranted notice, but history has a way of elevating the improbable. When the last Lancastrian male heirs died on battlefields or in shadowy towers, Henry became the unlikely standard-bearer for a cause everyone else had abandoned. His survival was itself a miracle, hunted by Yorkist agents, nearly captured in a storm-tossed escape across the Channel, and perpetually one misstep from assassination. Yet this very obscurity became his armor. While Richard III crushed rebellions and alienated allies, Henry lurked in the shadows, weaving a web of alliances with disgruntled Yorkists and French backers who saw him as a useful tool. The turning point came in 1485 when Richard's grip began to slip. The disappearance of the princes, the sudden death of his own son, and the growing restlessness of the nobility created cracks in the Yorkist edifice. Henry seized the moment. With borrowed French troops and a ragtag band of English exiles, he landed at Milford Haven, a spot chosen not for strategy but for superstition. Welsh prophecies spoke of a Mab Darogan, a son of destiny who would rise from the west. His army was laughably small, barely 5,000 men against Richard's seasoned 15,000. But wars aren't always won by numbers. Key Yorkist defectors like the Stanleys played both sides, waiting to see which way the wind blew. When the two armies clashed at Bosworth Field, it wasn't just steel that decided the day, it was betrayal. Richard's charge nearly reached Henry, but Stanley's forces swung the battle at the last moment, encircling the king and cutting him down in the mud. The crown, legend says, was plucked from a thorn bush and placed on Henry's head, a scene so poetic it might as well have been scripted. Victory was only the beginning. Henry knew that to rule, he needed more than a bloody banner and a tenuous claim. His masterstroke was marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, uniting the white rose and the red. Their union was pitched as the healing of England's wounds, but it was also cold calculation. The Tudor rose white petals wrapped in red became the perfect symbol, a merger of factions, a promise of peace. Yet Henry trusted no one, least of all his new relatives. He backdated his reign to before Bosworth, branding any Yorkist loyalists as traitors. He packed his court with loyal Welshmen and Beaufort connections, sidelining the old nobility. And when impostors like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck claimed to be lost Plantagenet princes, Henry crushed them with a mix of military force and legal precision, proving that the age of chivalric rebellion was over. His reign was a study in paradox. The same man who founded the Star Chamber to curb noble lawlessness also imposed crippling taxes to fill his coffers. He promoted trade and stabilized the currency, yet his suspicious nature led to a network of spies that made England feel like a police state. By the time he died in 1509, the Plantagenet threat had been meticulously erased, through marriage, through war, and through the quiet disappearance of anyone with a drop of rival blood. The Tudor dynasty, built on the ashes of 30 years of civil war, would redefine England. But Henry's greatest legacy wasn't just the throne he won, it was the brutal lesson he embedded in England's bones. That unity, however fragile, was worth any price. Henry Tudor sat uneasily on his stolen throne, knowing one truth above all: bloodlines don't vanish just because crowns change hands. The Plantagenets might have fallen at Bosworth, but their shadow loomed large in the form of lingering claimants, each a potential spark for rebellion. The first to test Henry's grip was Lambert Simnel, a 10-year-old boy plucked from obscurity by Yorkist loyalists and paraded as Edward, Earl of Warwick, the real Warwick being very much alive but imprisoned in the Tower. The irony was rich. A king who'd seized power through a dubious claim now faced a fake prince crafted from his own playbook. Simnel's backers, led by the disgraced Earl of Lincoln, went all in, crowning the boy in Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral with a circlet borrowed from a statue of the Virgin Mary. But Henry, ever the pragmatist, didn't just raise an army, he orchestrated a spectacle. After crushing the rebels at Stoke Field in 1487, he pardoned the child impostor, putting him to work in the royal kitchens as a scullion. The message was clear: even rebellion could be turned into theater, and mercy could be sharper than the sword. Yet barely 2 years later, a more dangerous ghost appeared: Perkin Warbeck, a handsome Fleming whose uncanny resemblance to the lost princes of the Tower gave his claim terrifying plausibility. This wasn't some puppet waved by nobles. Warbeck was a chameleon who convinced courts from Burgundy to Scotland that he was Richard of York, the younger prince supposedly murdered years before. His patrons included Margaret of York, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy and sister to Edward IV, who outfitted him with counterfeit royal manors and a fleet. When he landed in Cornwall in 1497, thousands flocked to his banner, not because they believed him, but because they craved any weapon against Henry's heavy taxes. The rebellion collapsed, but Warbeck's survival in the public imagination gnawed at Henry's nerves. After 2 escape attempts from the Tower, the second allegedly involving a conspiracy with the real Edward Warwick, Henry stopped the charade. Warbeck swung from a gibbet at Tyburn, his body left to rot as a reminder of the cost of defiance. Henry's paranoia wasn't baseless. The Plantagenet bloodline still pulsed through veins across Europe, and he methodically snipped every thread. Edward Plantagenet, the true Earl of Warwick, spent 14 years imprisoned before a trumped-up treason charge sent him to the block in 1499. Margaret Pole, Warwick's sister and last legitimate Plantagenet heir, was spared for a time. Henry's son, the future Henry VIII, would later have her executed in her 60s, her frantic run around the scaffold evoking the brutality of a dynasty determined to bury its past. Even distant cousins like the de la Poles, exiled but never forgotten, were hunted down. Richard de la Pole, the White Rose, died fighting for France at Pavia in 1525, the last gasp of open Plantagenet resistance. But erasing a dynasty isn't just about bloodshed, it's about rewriting memory. Henry cannily co-opted Plantagenet symbols, adopting Edward IV's sunburst badge and marrying Elizabeth of York to drape himself in their legitimacy. The Tudor rose wasn't just a merger of colors, it was a propaganda coup, a visual sleight of hand that let the past and present coexist. Yet the Plantagenet legacy seeped deeper than heraldry. Their legal reforms, Henry II's circuits of justice, Edward I's model parliament became the skeleton of English governance. The common law they nurtured outlasted them, evolving into a system where even kings weren't above the law. And their wars, for all the chaos, forged something unexpected, a sense of Englishness. The language of Chaucer, once the tongue of peasants, became the language of court under Edward III, while the 100 Years' War birthed the longbow's mythic status as the great equalizer. The paradox of the Plantagenets is that their greatest victory came in defeat. The Tudors might have claimed their throne, but they inherited their blueprint for power. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, he did so using the same royal supremacy that Plantagenets like Henry II had asserted over the Church. When Elizabeth I faced Spain's armada, she invoked the same defiant spirit that had driven Edward III at Crecy. The Plantagenets didn't just rule England, they invented the idea of England as a sovereign entity, separate from the continent's feudal webs. Their dynastic squabbles birthed Parliament, their legal codes underpinned modern justice, and their knack for self-destruction became a cautionary tale that shaped monarchy itself. To study them isn't just to revisit medieval battles, it's to witness the messy, bloody birth of a nation. The Plantagenet dynasty didn't just rule England, they reshaped it through centuries of relentless ambition, betrayal, and warfare. Their power struggles became the furnace in which England's political identity was forged, transforming a fractured feudal backwater into a centralized state with laws, parliament, and a growing sense of national identity. From Henry II's legal reforms to Edward I's ruthless conquests, each monarch left scars and innovations that echoed far beyond their lifetimes. The Magna Carta, born from John's tyranny, became the cornerstone of constitutional governance. The 100 Years' War, sparked by Edward III's vanity, birthed English nationalism and a professional army. Even the Wars of the Roses, which destroyed the dynasty, cleared the way for the Tudor Renaissance by eliminating the old nobility's stranglehold on power. Yet the Plantagenet legacy wasn't just institutional, it was cultural. Their courtly rituals birthed chivalry, their patronage nurtured English literature, and their clashes with the Church laid groundwork for the Reformation. Their dynastic saga also posed a haunting question: was this cycle of violence inevitable? Could rulers like Henry II have avoided turning their children into rivals by sharing power earlier? Might Richard the Lionheart's empire have survived if he'd governed rather than conquered? The tragedy of the Plantagenets lies in their brilliance and brutality being two sides of the same coin. Their ambition built kingdoms but also sowed the seeds of their ruin, proving that no dynasty can thrive when loyalty is measured in land rather than love. As the Tudor rose grew from the ashes of Bosworth, one wonders, did England need these centuries of bloodshed to become the nation it is today? Or was there another path, one where kings ruled with wisdom instead of swords, and where power didn't always demand a pound of flesh? The Plantagenets answer with silence, leaving us only their tangled legacy of glory and grief, and the uneasy knowledge that history's greatest lessons are often written in